All right, in our last video we talked about different roles and status positions, and in this we're going to start getting into how these positions make up different types of groups and structure different relationships among members of groups. And then in the next video we'll look at one of the largest kinds of groups, bureaucracies. So the first thing we want to think about is what is a group and what isn't. And this is an important definitional term. And again, this comes back to for the reason we make this distinction is that we don't want to go around studying something that doesn't really fall into the right category. So a group is a collection of individuals from two or more who have a shared sense of purpose or identity. So shared sense of purpose or identity. So if you think about a sports team, they might have a bit of both, but their shared purpose is to go win the game. And they are a group of people, a bunch of people, however many, 57 people on a football team, dedicated towards that purpose. They may eventually come to identify personally with that organization. Today we'll see that that's in professional sports, that's not always the case. This group can be as small as 2 people, so a dyad. If we think about what's the smallest group of 2, typically it's a couple. Right? If you think about people who've been together for a little while, they will typically talk about we. Right? They have a shared sense of identity. They are a couple, and they identify as a couple. This can be as large as a nation. People within America, many identify as American. They see it as part of their identity as belonging to that group. Many also might not. So this is different than what we just call an aggregate. Aggregate in math just means to add up. So just kind of a bunch of people in the same space. Right? So if we think about a line at a movie theater, I mean, we don't aggregate anymore, or we try not to. But a line at a movie theater, for example, they don't identify as people in line at a movie theater. And while each individual in that might have the purpose of going to see a movie, they don't have a collective purpose as a group of going to see the same movie. People are going to different movies, they have different interests, and they don't really identify with the other people as fellow moviegoers. Right? So these are all around where people just tend to gather, but don't necessarily tend to be a group that identifies as a group. There's no sense of we-ness there. Similarly with a category, this is an externally imposed grouping. This can overlap, but typically things like racial and ethnic groups, race groups in particular, can be an externally imposed grouping. Or the nerds in high school might be a category imposed upon a group of people, whether they wanted that way or not. People labeled them that way, and they are grouped that way. If we think about racial identity, we group people as Latin American or Latinx, but most of the people who are falling into that racial category actually identify more with a particular national lineage, so Puerto Rican, Mexican, Cuban, and have very different identities and histories around that. So groups are not just aggregates or categories, they have gatherings of people with a shared sense of purpose and or identity. All right, so when we want to think about those social status positions and these kinds of groups we're going to talk about, typically groups are made up of particular arrangements of positions. So a dyad, a romantic group, there's 2 romantic partners. And there are particular roles expected of each romantic partner in that kind of relationship. If you're on a basketball team, there are particular positions. There's the forward, there's the shooter. I don't know, I don't really follow basketball, but you know what they are if you do. And each person in that position is expected to fill out those kinds of roles. In any school you go into, you will see teachers and students and maybe an administrator. right? And we know what to expect of each of those and how they relate to each other. Right? So your status and roles create a particular expectations of how do you relate to, how do you deal with other people in that group. We break these down by particular types of groups and the relationships among members. We'll see this gets a little messy, but that's fine. Primary groups or primary relations are more effective or emotional relationships. They tend to be, much deeper ties. This tends to lead to smaller groups and also much more long-lasting ties. Many of you may still be good friends with people you know in high school, in your personal friend group. Family relations tend to last over great periods of time and despite a lot of family issues. So primary groups, small, more emotional or effective, and longer lasting. Secondary groups or secondary relations tend to be much more short term, and the relationships are instrumental or goal oriented. Instrumental meaning the relations are merely meant to get a person to a particular goal. As a group, you have a goal to achieve. Right? And these tend to be characteristic of larger groups. So if you think of the entire workforce in a fast food restaurant, people there aren't necessarily emotionally connected to each other, but as a group they want to get through the shift together, and everybody has their position and their role to play in that position. You think on a large team, same thing. Everybody has a shared goal. The team may or may not be close, and typically those things kind of go together. After the game is over, they've won or lost, they got paid, they go home to the people they have close relationships with. So one of the things we'll be doing in class this week is thinking about these different categories. We'll be bringing up this slide. Thinking about, first off, is it a group, a category, or an aggregate? Right? Is it a primary or secondary group? Another thing I want you to think about is how do primary relations form within these secondary groups, these larger groups? What happens when we start forming a clique inside our work group, right? The people we work with. What happens if people develop romantic attractions in those contexts? And how does that strain the secondary group goals? So today, formal secondary types of groups tend to dominate a lot of our lives. These are very typical of modern society. We move in and out of these organizations where we're not really tied to anyone else. When we relate to other people in them, we're very goal-oriented. Think of, you talk to your cashier most every day at the grocery store. You have a purpose. You're not there to meet somebody. You're both there to achieve a transaction. And the key examples of this are bureaucracies, these large, formal, meaning they have written rules and regulations, these formal organizations of which more and more of us are a part of and get lost inside.